Backyard Green Films is proud to present this episode of Agri-Culture with your host, Alara Bowman. Alara and her husband Rick travel throughout the land in their teardrop trailer that they have nicknamed Maggie, bringing you stories about their travels and the people they meet. They visit farmers, ranchers, and just about anyone who loves putting their hands in the dirt or their feet in stirrups. For the past 3 years, they have been filming a documentary about heritage breed animals entitled The Holstein Dilemma, Heritage Breeds, and the Need for Biodiversity. In those travels, they have gotten to meet some very interesting people. Here's one of those interviews.
Well, we were at the Sheep and Wool Festival in Rhinebeck last month. We had a great conversation with 3 of the farmers about something near and dear to my heart, and I got really excited when the topic came up. So today, we're going to bring you that conversation, and we're going to talk about one of my very favorite things, dirt. Now, I love dirt. I like to dig in the dirt and study dirt and move dirt around. When we're driving across country, we'll see a spot that has really rich-looking ground, and Rick has to stop me from jumping out of the car to run over and roll in it. Yes, I know I am the dog in this scenario, and I'm not the least bit shameful about it. Well, okay, so I'm calling it dirt, but the thing I really love is actually soil. And it's the living stuff, not really so much the dead stuff. Most people would think I'm kind of weird to say that soil is alive, but I'm telling you that once you put a shovel in the ground and turn it over, you'll know the difference right away between dead dirt and living soil. We kind of take the earth below us for granted. It's just dirt, right? It's a bunch of rocks under our feet of different sizes. We till it up a little, throw things on it, plant things in it, water it, add some sun, and everything grows. And as long as you have the components, we kind of assume we're on a dependable track. Aha, but maybe not. We're finding out now that the underground world is a pretty complex place. You can do a web search and find tons of great information, of course. If you really want some interesting reading, I highly recommend books by Jeff Lowenfels, including Teeming with Microbes. Fantastic books on the soil food web. So for all of you non-gardeners out there, I'll give you a quick summary of how I think of dirt and soil, and the difference between the two. Nice soil is usually a mix of ingredients, just like a cake. The most basic part of the dirt word for most everybody starts with mineral objects of various sizes. And we have 3 sizes that people usually refer to called sand, silt, and clay. The size of the little rock particles is often the thing that determines how much air can flow or water can drain. In the case of sand, the first thing, the particles are big, and air and water flow freely around. The drainage is pretty fast, which would seem to be really good, but that also means that things dry out quickly, and that nutrients can move out of the soil quickly as well. You probably don't have any trouble digging in this kind of material, but you have to water it all the time, and you have to really fertilize a lot. Silt is the next size down, and it's halfway between sand and clay, so the pieces are a little closer together. And sometimes this one feels slippery when it's wet. The third type of soil material is clay. This is the finest size, and things pack pretty close together. That means clay allows for less water movement and drains slowly, or sometimes not at all. But it also means that the soil will hold on to nutrients better. It tells you a lot about clay when you think about the fact that it's one of the oldest and most common building materials on the planet, and we've used it to make bricks forever and a day. Adobe, cob, mortar, and rammed earth. Those are all things that we associate with clay, so not necessarily good as the main ingredient in a vegetable garden. You might think of those 3 sizes of rocks as the corners on a triangle. Great soil often has a nice combination of the 3 sizes of sand, silt, and clay. If you have those 3 in the right combination, you usually have something called loam, which is right in the middle of the triangle. It's the gardener's dream. There's spacing between the parts for breathability, and water and nutrient retention are in that happy medium area. And yes, in my opinion, dirt does breathe, just like we all do. But those 3 sizes of base materials are only the first and the most basic component of good soil. There's water, of course, which is a critically necessary factor even if you're growing less water-reliant crops. The ground is often like a big sponge, and believe it or not, there can be tons of water stored underground that looks completely parched on the surface. Sometimes more water than you actually want, as you'll soon hear. And air is in those spaces too, and of course that's super important. There are also other minerals, including things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, zinc, and the list goes on and on. They all do things for the plants just like our vitamins and minerals do for people. So if you take them out of the ground, you've got to put them back in, or eventually your dirt is harder and harder to use to grow things. And as we mentioned above, if there's not enough space between the particles, there's no room for anything else to get in there, including roots and critters and bugs. So the nutrients are then unavailable to get to the plants either way. The important players in underground life go on and on, but they include pH, micro and macro decomposers, light, temperature, organic material. You get the point. We'll do more on dirt later, mostly because I love it so much I just can't talk about it only once, and because it's the absolute first step in anything having to do with agriculture. But the big thing I'd like to emphasize is that dirt is like anything else in life. It needs balance. There's a lot of elasticity in good dirt, and nature is really powerful in terms of recovering from too much or not enough of one thing or another. But there's a limit. And sometimes too much or too little are worse than almost anything else that could happen. This podcast is about just that. Heather, Marie, and Jerry are farmers who raise sheep, but in this case, it's all about the dirt, literally. We're recording here in San Diego, California, a city that of late has had an average annual rainfall of 4 to 10 inches over the last 10 years or so. After listening to these ladies speak of rain on the East Coast and what it's done to them and their livelihoods, maybe instead of hoping for rain, maybe I'll just wish for a little balance instead.
I'm Heather Loomis. I have a farm in north central PA called Bolaris Orchards.
And I'm Marie Minnick, and I am the purveyor of sheep on Mariska Farms in central Pennsylvania.
And I'm Jerry Robinson Lawrence, and I have Flying Fibers flock in also south central Pennsylvania, near Lancaster and York, Pennsylvania.
Okay, and just really quickly, give me a noun, type of breed that you raise.
Rommeldale CVM.
Rommeldale CVM.
North American Wensleydale and Shetlands.
And I just have to tell you that every time I hear Wensleydale, I'm sure everybody does this, but I just hear Wensleydale is Wallace and Gromit, right?
Yes.
Somebody says, why didn't he pick our sheep? So now we are sitting here because there was a really interesting thing that we were talking about in one of the shepherd's talks that I found fascinating from a husbandry standpoint. We were talking about nutrient uptake and how rainfall has really impacted pasture management. So I'm going to ask you, Heather, to go and just kind of give us the blurb a little bit on the problem that came up and what the solution was for you.
Sure. So we were talking some about how a lot of us are seeing our flocks have not been necessarily doing well in the last year to maybe a year and a half. And a lot of that here in the Mid-Atlantic region through the greater part of 2018 and into the better half of 2019, we dealt with a lot of rainfall to the point of oversaturation. So they were record rainfalls for both years. And one of the farming friends that I have had said to us that a dry year will scare you, but a wet year will starve you.
Well, if we're from California, so water is good, right?
So water is a good thing, one would think. The challenge ends up being that soil requires air pockets. And because root systems and microbes within the soil require oxygen for them in order for all of that to function correctly. And so what happens when you don't have those air pockets and all of that is saturated and sitting full of water, those microbes are starved for oxygen, as is the root system of any plant, whether that's a fruit tree or your pasture for grazing or your hay fields. And what ends up happening is those microbes are so starved for oxygen, once they've used what's available, they take that oxygen out of other compounds that we need, and nutrient compounds. And you're talking about magnesium compounds, sulfur compounds, and nitrogen compounds specifically. And so the microbes will eat the oxygen out of those compounds, leaving just that basic element of magnesium, nitrogen, and sulfur. And what happens when you have just a basic compound sitting in that soil is it's not usable in that form to anything that's growing. It really needs to be in compound forms. And so what you have are plants that are growing because they're finding a way to survive, but they're growing without the nutrition in that background. So a lot of times that manifests as yellowed leaves that happen early on our fruits and vegetables. Even forage that seems to be growing very tall. They have, if it's a good forage, it has a very long root system, but it's still only being able to pull up so much as far as nutrition. And when you have an imbalance of all of those other compounds, you also have an imbalance of calcium, because calcium has to work in tandem with those other nutrients. And so you end up with a nutritional profile that's depleted. It still may be there, but it's not in the levels that we need within our forage. And that translates to your pasture grazing during your spring and summer and even your fall months. But even worse is it translates into our hay stores. So we are all either buying in our hay or have produced our hay already for the year, have it sitting in our barns. And what we know is that we are going into a winter that we've already had a summer, a whole year before, of nutritionally not dense food for our animals. We're now entered a grazing season, and we're finishing that up here in the Northeast now with what looked like a lot of green forage available, but that is nutritionally depleted. And we're going into another winter of hay in our barns, or coming into our barns, that is nutritionally depleted.
Now, do you know that when the moment strikes? Because I believe that we had a gal in the shepherd's talk that said, my sheep are eating more hay, and they're eating whatever I put out there aside from what's out in the field. Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, and still not having the condition that they should have. And that's, most of us that are not long-term farmers and aren't as familiar with a lot of the forage stuff. I mean, I see green grass and the sheep eating it, and I think everything's fine. But when you start actually feeling the condition of the sheep, and you realize that they are thinner than they should be based on how much they've been eating and how much you continue to feed them, you realize something isn't right. And after a while, you say, what's going on? And you do the research that Heather's done, and you understand that despite the fact that they're eating a lot of volume, they're not eating a lot of quality.
So for us, we might get a craving, or for me personally, Talenti ice cream, and I say, oh, that's because I want sugar. But animals self-regulate much better than we do often, I would assume. And so therefore, if they crave a food, it's because they're deficient.
They really do need it. Okay. And so once you recognize there is a problem, or if you know ahead of time that you're expecting this to be a problem because you're a longtime farmer who's lived this before, or you've done a lot of the nutritional research, you know that you're going to have to provide additional stores for these animals to be able to get any of the nutrients the extra nutrients that they need. So many of us, whether or not we understood exactly what was going on, started trying to supplement our sheep. Whether it was with additional grain and corn, or protein tubs or things like that in excess of the forage that they were eating, so that we could keep condition on the sheep. We didn't, we knew we needed to do something. All of these things obviously impact the input costs for raising sheep, and it can have a very negative effect on flocks in terms of both the individual sheep and how large a flock someone can actually keep.
Okay, but there's a couple different components there when you say the costs, because we're not just talking about by the time you figured out that the current feed is deficient, we're talking about the additional cost you're going to need to get that supplemental nutrient in them at that current moment. You're going to talk about maybe the potential future costs because you're going to have to do a little bit of management in the field. So you're going to have to either buy manure, which Jerry, we're going to be talking about that, or you're going to have to do something else to supplement that feed so next year's hay crop is okay. But this year's hay crop already might be in that space. And this year's fleece might be deficient as well, correct?
Right.
Correct. Shorter.
Yes.
Less.
In some cases,
less
weaker.
Quality. Weaker,
less quality.
Breaks. In our case, it could become more coarse.
So, but You shear in 6-month or 1-year cycles, maybe, or whatever
1
that
year.
is.
Yep.
So you're not just talking about a loss of a month or two in there when you figure it out. You're
No.
talking
You lose
about
the
that
whole
whole
fleece.
You're using the whole
6-month
fleece.
fleece.
Yes, that whole
Yeah.
clip, and it could be across your whole flock. You could lose the clip, that year's clip, from all of them.
Okay, so this is major economic impact for
Yes.
current year plus next year.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Plus whatever your stores are, because that feeds the year after that.
Yep.
Right?
That's
Yes.
right. And you're talking about, yesterday we talked about soil's a long end game.
Yeah, it doesn't,
So
you can't correct it this fall for next spring.
Yeah, you're talking about years for it to correct the balance for all of that.
Once you figured out that you have a problem.
Yeah, once you
you're already in.
establish that.
And once the weather will actually begin to cooperate
Yes.
and return soils to the point where they have oxygen in pockets
Yes.
again,
Yes.
because if it continues to be saturated the way it is, your pasture, you can't change your pasture management to actually improve it well,
Yes.
because the weather's working against you.
Exactly. Okay, so which brings me to Jerry. Beautiful segue. Thank you much for that. So we're going to move into this thing. Once you do have that problem with water and you realize, holy cow, what am I supposed to do with the pasture because it's still wet? You had an issue and you had a kind of a
I
solution.
had really serious issues with my land. Firstly, I bought land that it was affordable, aka something was wrong with it. That's why it was affordable. I thought I could fix it with my animals on it. We were well underway, and then we had 18 months of rain in Pennsylvania. And there was one particular storm that just stalled over a part of York County where we got 8 to 10 inches of rain in 4 hours. So that, I'm a bull. That was one of what's wrong with my property and why it was affordable. But it always had something on it, so I thought, well, everything grows. But those rains were so intense that it rilled my hillside. It looked essentially like every 6 inches to a foot, someone took a jackhammer down my hillside and just destroyed it. And I had just prior to that storm dragged it to loosen the earth, seeded it, put the nitrogen on it, and it all raced into the river. So it was just devastating and heartbreaking. So I went through the last year with dirt, nothing to forage. So it was essentially 4 acres of dry lot, and which meant I had to feed them the hay that I bought from someone, which wasn't entirely nutritious. And I also have to buy a really high-end grain for them. I go through 50 pounds of grain every other day, which is costly. And I have the mineral supplements, and the hay is hundreds of dollars, and it's pretty phenomenal. So I brought in an ecologist. I was actually embarrassed at the quality of my fields and didn't want anyone to see them, but it got to the point where I needed help. And so I brought in an ecologist and an agronomist and worked with them to develop a plan for fixing my problem. But again, they said it's going to be years.
Yeah.
So I had to adjust. I had to get rid of all those ditches coming down my hillside first, and it's not going to be an expensive process, but it's going to require a lot of person power.
The
and
infrastructure is not going to be expensive. However,
Correct.
grain at $50 every other day
Yes.
or 50 pounds seems to
Yes.
be slightly expensive.
Yes.
Yes.
So yes, that's where the cost comes in. So ultimately, if I can fix my pasture, I can lower those costs. But the good thing is, on top of my feed costs, it is not going to then cost me thousands upon thousands to repair my pasture. It's just a lot of physical hours on the land. So I have to develop swales, so I have to alter the shape, essentially make stairs.
So for everybody that doesn't
acres.
know, swales are basically these big bumps in the middle that slow the water down and have a
Yes.
tendency to let it sit in one place so it can soak in and you can
Yes.
replenish the groundwater, right?
And I'm also putting in check dams and I'm harvesting the wood from my own property because I have a wooded area. So I'm using logs and branches to create check dams, which also slow the water flow. Human beavers.
It is
I'm doing
human
what the
beavers.
beavers did.
Yes, but
Yes.
this is immediately when you were talking talking about that in class, I thought agri-Culture, which is this thing that I looked up got interested in because I do composting, and that's the thing that you basically plant woody material, carbonous material, and you in various sizes, and that encourages life to grow and the soil to replenish itself, microbial activity. It's basically kind of like a big compost pile on steroids with a lot of woody material in it, right? So that makes a lot of sense to me because you are not only replenishing the immediacy of the thing, it's also helping to do the same thing that a root system does. It slows water and something holds on to the dirt, to the soil.
And part of why this happened to me is because everybody around me took our beautiful dirt roads and paved them.
Yeah.
So now that water, instead of going into the earth, is going off of those paved roads and just pummeling my pasture.
Well, this is an interesting thing that we all take for granted. You ask any farmer in Kansas and they're going to say, yeah, topsoil is kind of an interesting and very important thing to me, but we had to learn that. In many ways. So it's the layer on top that really makes the difference, but it's not just to farmers, kind of as we associate with. It's to anybody that raises animals, anybody that lives on the land. That's your skin. Yes. So you were smart about it, got somebody in there, and they're at least going to get you on the right path to moving forward, and now you know.
And
right?
I'm really excited to say that in a 10-day period, we took our first steps and rented a skid loader with a harrow on it and got rid of all those rills and seeded it, and in 10 days we have grass. It's an annual, so it'll just hold the earth together for the winter, and then I'll have to put a perennial on in the spring, but step one is complete and there's grass.
Fantastic. Well, and you have sheep too, which is a little easier on the land in terms of pasture management, correct?
But I had to get them off of it. They can't be on it right now, so I'm still dry lotting and keeping them off that hillside.
So they have to establish. It has to establish itself at least.
Because the shorter the grass is, the shorter the roots are.
Yes.
So I can't let them go down, and then it takes 17 days for, if they go too low, for it to recover from that, and so I have to. To keep them off.
You have to do a lot of math.
A lot of math and keep them off of it.
Maybe those of us in California that eat lamb and that wear wool are going to think about this next time we think, damn it, they have all that rain in Pennsylvania.
No, it's not a good thing.
It's not a good thing.
It would be nice if we could have spread some of ours to California.
I've thought that before.
And just sort of shared.
Yes.
And we would have been willing to.
Yes.
Moderation is a wonderful thing.
Yes, it is. So to go back to the, it seems like there's multiple issues here. If you do need to figure out if you're deficient in something before you get to your hay crop, before you get to the 50 pounds every other day stage, before you get to the major fixing thing, we were talking about soil testing and when is too much and when is not enough and what might be good.
Right. Soil testing is bar none the end all. Like, you need to be soil testing, and it's easily done through extension offices, and a lot of the land grant universities in most states will have departments that do that soil testing for you. And then you can use your cooperative extension offices to help get some information as to how you should be fertilizing and what it is you want to use. And what you're using may depend on how it is that you're raising your animals or your crops. So if you're looking to do just a more traditional, conventional approach, there's certain items that you'll want to be using or can use, and you might get a quicker response to it. For us, we do everything as organically and naturally as we can, and so for us, it's a matter of, we use a lot of compost, and what we do is we incorporate a lot of our nutrient inputs into our compost. And what happens by us having done that is it gives it a chance to start breaking down with the compost, and it makes all of those inputs, such as green sand and lime, it makes all of them far more accessible and ready to be used by the soil. So we can get a little bit quicker turnaround on some of those inputs for us. But again, even with those inputs, you're talking 2 to 3 years out from when you see a lot of the results from that. And a lot of that has to be the weather beginning, it always ebbs and flows in seasons of dry and seasons of wet, and hopefully we're hitting something that's a little bit more moderate in pace, and it will give that soil a few years to do some moderation of its own and get back into that natural balance of things before we likely hit a dry spell.
Yeah, well, you all are raising specific breeds, and many of them are heritage breeds that have adapted, and so we maybe are in the course of adaptation.
Absolutely.
But we just don't have quite that longer period period of time
That's
to
right.
do
That's
it.
right.
Well,
Yes.
which is why it's so important actually to keep some of these breeds around, because the breeds that have been, a lot of these traits have been bred out of, are going to need the traits bred back into them.
Yeah.
For food for the masses.
Yeah, I love that story with the marsh tackies, where the marsh tacky, if everybody doesn't know, it's the horse that basically the swamp fox kind of used to fight in the war, because they'll go in the mud, they don't care, they're
right.
not really
And they
fussy.
can do it.
Their hooves are a little less sensitive to muck, and you know,
Yeah.
so you think about it, yeah, it's a great characteristic. But meanwhile, when you're in the spot you're in, you all have to really highly manage. It's management of the soil as well as the sheep. You are
Yeah.
basically
Absolutely.
husbandry. You are involved in husbandry of the land.
Yes.
You are
Yes.
stewards of the land.
Yes.
You're not just a shepherd of the sheep.
Every farmer should think of themselves as a soil farmer,
Yep.
because if you can understand soil and what's happening there first, then
Yep.
you are a much better steward to whatever you may be growing, whether it's fruits, vegetables, or livestock.
Yep.
Beautiful. That was fantastic. Go ahead, go to it.
Dead dirt. So
Oh,
we interviewed Bob
yeah.
Quinn. He's a wheat farmer in Montana, and he's a dryland farmer. But he talks about your dirt is dead. You've got to, and up there, the reason he says that he doesn't water in his dryland is because the alkaloids.
It's too alkaline. The soil is too alkaline, and so they can't really pull it up and spread it all over the top of the land without
Right.
really impacting other things. So it's
Interesting.
interesting that you, in your conversation about the wet ground, in many ways is kind of mirroring the issues of the dry ground, but it's all in the management of the
Yes.
soil. It's in the life in the soil. They're finding that the amount of biodiversity you have in the soil impacts the elasticity of your soil and
Yep.
the ability of it to bounce back. It might just
Absolutely.
not be. And that's the problem, Jerry, with your topsoil, is that there's no life left. It's all washed away. And so we have to reestablish that base of diversity in order to have that elasticity and bounce back ability. Yes.
Well, the farmland that I actually use for my pasture had been used as cropland for 50 plus years before we brought our sheep onto it. And in our area, other cropland, if they look at it, the topsoil is about a really good farm will have 4 inches of topsoil. And about 5 years, 6 years after we started pasturing the sheep on our land, our local NRCS office asked to have a meeting at our farm for NRCS people that from around the region in Pennsylvania, and any local farmers that wanted to show up. And they asked us to dig a soil pit so that they could assess what our soil now looks like, knowing what it did before. And that soil pit indicated that we had now gotten to the point where we had 12 to 16 inches of topsoil. The root systems were going down, a full 4 feet. And worm trails all the way down. So much different just at that point. And that, of course, was about a year and a half before we started all this rain. But it was really, it was so striking to me because, it's very apparent where the lines occur. And to see that regeneration in a relatively short period of time was really neat.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm just going to go off on a different tangent here because I have the 3 of you sitting here and I want you to touch everybody's sweaters. So one of my on a completely separate note, one of my really not peeves, one of my passion projects is economic viability and translation of cost. And I think average consumers have lost the ability to understand why they have to pay $10 a pound for hamburger if they want good hamburger. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to ask you, based on the products you have, and this is a personal question, but I do accounting, bookkeeping, so I'm going to ask it anyway, just because I have to get that in there. If you had to make that gorgeous vest, if you had to put a price on that, tell me why that thing would be over $200.
The wool is entirely from my flock of Rommeldale CVM sheep, which the wool per pound would retail at $20 per pound raw off of my sheep. And this product, just in wool alone, I likely have over $100. And this actually, interestingly enough, the felt is probably one of the more expensive products that I have made, and I have it made using more of my waste wool than anything else. And fleeces that I can't use, like several last year that had wool breaks due to the nutritional deficiency.
And basically felting is squished wool. I mean, it's wool that's
this
shrunk,
is
so
just
you're
a
losing.
compaction of wool.
Right.
I'm as warm as the sheep that are around here, let me tell you right now. It's been cozy. But then I took time to design this pattern and fit this to myself, and then got a quality zipper, because if I'm going to wear this quality of wool, I'm going to have a quality zipper. So, you know, those are not cheap. I think it was at least $12 for the zipper. And this vest is me and my flock.
Yes.
Right? I spend easily 3 hours a day tending to my flock. Sometimes it's active chore work. In the summer and spring months, it's more delightful visiting work. I spend just as much time in the spring and summer, because those are times where I found it just as key for me to wander and to hang out, to get a sense of how they're all doing. Because when you spend the time with that animal, as soon as you walk into the flock, you know immediately somebody's not doing well. And so that's a lot. That's my time. That's my
And
everyday.
that goes into these
And all
walls.
of that comes back into the products that we all are having made and then are making for ourselves. So there's a lot of time involved in raising money, or
But-
raising our animals to have an economic payback for
Yes,
ourselves. We're
but you're-
running businesses.
You're flat out at $100 cost before you ever
Right,
put that
before-
calculation
before
in
you
there.
count
Before
time.
you even make that product.
And then hours
Yeah.
of the rest of it. So yes, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Okay, Maria, I'm going to talk about that sweater. How long did it
Okay.
take you to make?
So this is yarn made from my flock. I did not hand spin it. This is spun by a woolen mill in Vermont. But again, I can do sort of the cost analysis. For retail, I charge around $20 a pound for wool, raw wool. I charge myself $10 a pound wholesale when I'm calculating my costs. I charge $10 a pound as it's going to the mill. I charge myself the transport to and from the mill, which is costly because we're using freight. It doesn't happen to be drivable distance, and I charge all of the mill costs. For a 4-ounce skein of yarn, my cost is $14.
Well, of course, everybody has a mill next door, right?
Oh,
So-
of course. That's which is a whole other issue about
But how
dealing
many,
with.
how many mills do you think you have if you really need to send it somewhere? Are there 500 mills in this country where you can send that to?
No.
Are there 100? Are there 50?
No, I'm not sure there are 20 that we
Okay.
could sell this particular type wool to.
Okay, so that speaks volumes right there. Sure,
Okay.
limited. Okay, so you're stuck in with that cost, whether you
Right.
want it or not.
That's right.
Right. I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
So then we've got the sheep, we've got the mill, and then you haven't even started to make the sweater yet, right?
Right. Well,
Okay.
and I haven't talked about any of the other costs like hiring a shearer to come in and do quality work and all that kind of stuff. But the hours in this, about 45 hours of hand knitting. So
I'll
if
let
I want to
everybody out
charge,
there make whatever
that's
their
right.
hourly rate is, make that
So
calculation.
when you're looking at hand knit sweaters, if you just count, and there's 2 skeins of yarn in here, slightly more than 2 skeins of yarn. So even at my cost, I've got $28 to $30 worth of yarn in here, and 40 some hours of work. So even if I were only going to charge $1 an hour, for my time, and you really do need to charge more than that if you're going to be a hand knitter, you're looking at a $75, $80 cost.
Yeah. Okay, now as much as I want to ask you about your gorgeous sweaters and knit work, I'm going to actually ask you about the feed, because that's a part that
know
gets
about the feed.
left out. Yes.
So a lot of people will feed corn by itself because it's cheap. But corn is sugar, so it's not nutritionally balanced. It would be like feeding your children donuts constantly. So I actually pay for a feed that has been developed by someone who grew up in 4-H and who has looked at recipes and looked at dietary needs. And so I pay about $16 a bag.
The $50
And I go
bag.
through at least 15 is on the low side, 15 a month.
For how many sheep?
24, and I've been feeding them a little heavier because of my problem with the pasture. So I kind of don't count on purpose, because it will make you sick to your stomach when you realize you're spending more money on feed for your animals than you are for your family.
I do that with Rick too. We sort of don't talk about it.
Yeah,
really.
there's some things we just don't say.
Yeah, well, you know, and I could avoid a few meals, but.
And
So
then
that's just flat out just the.
that's just the
because-
grain.
And you are committed to this for the next, as we discussed, as long as until your ground's fixed. This is a 2-year plan.
Well, and unfortunately, my ground was not good from the get-go, so this has been, I've been doing this for 4 years.
Okay.
Not quite as heavily as I am right now, but yes. So people think I'm out of my mind. As somebody at work said, so I have a day job.
Yeah.
That
Don't we
pays,
all?
the
Yeah.
day job pays for it. You know, I don't go out to eat, I don't buy fancy clothes, I have sheep.
Yeah.
But they give me way more pleasure and happiness, and they calm my soul. You know, they do everything for me that an article of clothing from Kmart won't.
We talk about the triple bottom line in accounting, and the you have to add the additional factor of quality of life into farming, or
Yeah.
it doesn't compute. But once you
Yeah.
do, it makes perfect sense, because I can go and work an extra however many hours a week to go get
Right.
a spa treatment or my hair done or whatever brings you
Right.
joy.
Yes.
And yet, if I did not do that same thing, if I did not do the work to go pay for the things that brought me joy, I just looked out the back door every day. It's a beautiful thing, and you have to add that to the calculation,
Yeah.
or it doesn't compute.
And that's what it is. I will even I'm a teacher, so I will teach extra courses in the winter session and the summer session to pay for my sheep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I thank you all for that particular direction. I'm going to set my husband up for why I need to get a $400 sweater at some point in time in this conversation. But
Worth every penny. There you go. There you go.
See, that's the nice thing, you know.
I have a
Yes.
good marriage, don't I?
Yes.
Yeah, right. You know, I need more sheep, and Steve needs more skid steers.
Yeah, there you go.
Symbiotic relationships.
That's right.
I think that's going to go on the tagline somewhere in whatever. Thank you, ladies. If you liked our podcast, please subscribe. This is how we keep going. And please tell your friends to join us. Please feel free to post any questions or comments that you might have to our social media sites. Our Twitter feed is at Backyard Green Films, spelled BKYRDGREENFILMS. Our Instagram is at Backyard Green Films, BACKYARDGREENFILMS. Our Facebook is Backyard Green Films. Our YouTube URL is youtube.com/backyardgreenfilms.
We want to thank Heather of Belaris Orchards, Marie of Marishka Farms, and Jerry from Flying Fibers Farms for visiting with us today. For more information, please visit their websites at flyingfibers.com, marushkafarms.com, that is spelled MARUSHKA, and belarisorchards.com, spelled BOHLAYERS, orchards.com. You have been listening to Agri-Culture with your host, Alara Bowman. Please tune in for more upcoming episodes from our travels. We'd also like to thank our producer, Michelle Council. I'm Rick Bowman, your behind-the-scenes editor. Until next time. This has been a presentation of Backyard Green Films Productions, all rights reserved, copyright 2019.